what are we beginning with now? We're going to plot an LM curve. I would like you to plot the LM curve. Okay? Right. Okay. I'm going to draw it with you now quickly. Remember, we started with our money market, so we said that the money market, if we plotting interest rates, and now normally we would have an interest rate, we'd call it little I, and really, whether we call it I, whether we call it R, I don't want to get into too much detail about it, but for now we're just going to call it R when we know we're talking about the interest rate. We're plotting the money market. We've got a downward sloping money demand curve, MD, and we've got, just take a vertical money supply curve, MS. Now this level of money demand is made up of a transactions demand as well as an asset demand. Okay, and the transactions demand is related to how many real goods and services you want to buy. So let's say you want to buy some level of goods and services Y0. So buying some level of goods and services Y0 gives you some corresponding interest rate, some corresponding equilibrium interest rates in our money market R0. So if we now, and I'm plotting it over here, you'll see why just now, but if we want to now plot a relationship between interest rates and output, and when we want to plot the relationship that arises out of the money market, we have some interest rate R0 and some output level Y0 corresponding with this equilibrium interest rate. So if I just plot my R interest rate, R0, I have some level of output, call it Y0, and that's my first initial equilibrium point. So when we're plotting the LM curve from the money market, we then say, well, what happens if the level of output changes? What happens if we now increase the level of output, right? Which is the same as saying increase the level of production, which is the same as saying increase the amount of real goods and services in the economy. And with the amount of real goods and services in the economy being produced and becoming income, it means there needs to be more money transacting, right? Exchanging hands. Goods and services become income, right? In other words, production of goods and services becomes sale of goods and services, right? Production of goods and services becomes income for the laborers. All of those transactions are paid for with money. So with more output, we have more transactions, we have more money. Paying higher wages, buying more goods and services. So let's say that the level of output increases, okay? So we're going to go, level of output is going to increase. We're going to go from Y0 to Y1, and Y1 is greater than Y0. Okay. So if we've got a higher level of output, what happens to our money demand? The quantity of money demanded at any given interest rate increases. In other words, our transactions demand for money increases. When our transactions demand for money increases, our money demand curve shifts to the right. So we have a new money demand curve, MD given Y1. Okay? But if our interest rate was R0, okay, if our interest rate remained at our initial equilibrium interest rate R0, what is the problem in our money market? The problem is that the quantity of money demanded is greater than the quantity of money supplied, right? There is a problem here. Demand is greater than supply. So what happens if people want to get more money, but the Reserve Bank doesn't want to play ball, right? The Reserve Bank's like, no, we're not giving you any more money. How do people get more money? What do they have to do? They got to convert any savings that they held in non-monetary instruments into money. So, for example, if they had bonds, what do they do with their bonds? They sell their bonds. When you sell bonds, what do you think happens to the price of bonds? Price of bonds, you start selling bonds. No one wants bonds. The price of bonds starts going down. So what happens to the yield on bonds? When the price of bonds goes down, what happens to the interest rates on bonds? Starts going up, right? So as the interest rate starts going up, what happens to the quantity of money you want to hold for asset demand purposes? As interest rates go up, what happens to your holdings of money? The opportunity cost of you holding money is increasing. So what happens to the quantity of money you want to demand as an asset? You want to hold as an asset? It starts decreasing, correct? So as the interest rates in the bond markets and places like that starts going up, it drives interest rates up in the money market as well. Why? Because once interest rates in bond markets start going up, people say, hang on a minute, interest rates are going up. I don't necessarily want to hold money as an asset any longer because it's now costly. I'm giving up my interest rate I could be earning in the bond market. So interest rates start going up. What happens to the quantity of money demanded? Starts decreasing. And interest rates go up until eventually, well, we end up holding the same amount, well, the amount of money that was initially injected into the economy is the amount of money we end up holding. Why? Because we have converted money from asset money to transactions money. Okay? In other words, we end up holding the same amount of money, but for different reasons. We now end up holding more money for transactions and less money as an asset. Right? Because remember, there's two reasons that we hold money. Less money as an asset, but more money for transactions. So we end up holding the same amount of money, but the interest rate has gone up. Okay? We are now holding less money for as an asset because the interest rate has gone up. Right? We now would rather hold other kinds of financial instruments. Okay, so R1, our interest rate goes up. So now what do we have? Well, we have a higher level of output associated with a higher interest rate. So if we now plot our interest rate R1, the level of output that it corresponds to as an equilibrium point in our money market is higher than Y0. It's some level Y1. Righty-ho. Now we've got our upward sloping relationship. Here's our LM curve. Okay, and so the reason that I plotted those two like that was so that I could do this. Oh. Okay, so now I have an IS curve and an LM curve underneath each other. So we've got R, R, Y, Y, L, M, IS. You happy that we can combine this IS and LM curve? Right? So let me just draw that underneath again. Plotting output against interest rates. There's my LM curve. So LM. There's my IS curve, IS. Okay? And that is our ISLM model. What's interesting about the ISLM model is every point on the LM curve is a point of equilibrium in the money market. Yeah? Every point on the LM curve is a point of equilibrium in the money market. Every point on the IS curve is a point of equilibrium in the goods market. Yeah? Sorry? Yeah? Every point of equilibrium on the IS curve is equilibrium in our aggregate expenditure model, which is the model of the goods market. Okay? Now, what about the point of equilibrium in our ISLM model, where those two curves intersect? What that means is we have equilibrium in the money market and equilibrium in that goods market. Right? That's pretty cool. Point of equilibrium between the IS and LM curves, where those two intersect. Are you with me? Are you happy that at that point of intersection, I'm at a point on the IS curve? I'm at a point on the LM curve. So if I'm at a point on the IS curve, I'm at a point of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model. If I'm on the LM curve, I'm at a point of equilibrium in the money market. Which means at that point of equilibrium, I must have equilibrium in the money market and the goods market. That's pretty cool. Absolutely. Well, the amount of money that we're holding, right, is equal to the amount of money we need to purchase all our goods and services. And it's at a specific interest rate that corresponds to a level of investment, which leads to a level of spending, right? And that level of spending is equal to the level of output. And we're able to buy it because the amount of money we're holding is enough. So everything is, you can imagine all these moving parts, and we've got a nice kind of equilibrium. Okay? Okay, it's going to get real. Are you with me? So here's our ISLM curve. Okay? There are 5 different points here. We've got point A, we've got point B, we've got point C, we've got point D, we've got point E, and we've got point F. Points E and B are the same point here, and they're going to be our equilibrium point. Okay? In other words, this ISLM diagram that they've drawn here, points D, E, and F are from the LM curve, D, E, and F. Points A, B, and C are from the IS curve, points A, B, and C. And point B on the IS curve here and point E on the LM curve are the same point here. Points E and point B are the same point. That's where it intersects. Are you with me? Okay, now, this is what I would like you to answer for me, please. Point D. Consider point D. Is point D a point of equilibrium in our economy? In other words, is everything in equilibrium in our economy at point D? No. Okay? What is not in equilibrium? What's the problem with point D? Sorry? What's wrong with point D? What's not in equilibrium? Sorry? Right, in our aggregate expenditure model, we're not in equilibrium. How do we know we're not in equilibrium in our aggregate expenditure model? That's right, because we're not on our IS curve. All points of equilibrium are on the IS curve. Is point D on the IS curve? No. Okay. At point D, tell me what's wrong in the goods market. That's what I want you to do now. So take 5 minutes, talk to the people next to you, look at your aggregate expenditure model, figure out where is point D in your aggregate expenditure diagram. Where would point D be? Why are we not in equilibrium? What's happened? Okay, may I interrupt you briefly and just get your thoughts at this stage? Anyone got anything that they want to try out? Why do you think point D might be a point of disequilibrium? Anything that you want to suggest? Any initial thoughts? Where are you going with this? Sorry? Oh, someone's shouting. Excuse me? They are indeed producing too little. Okay. Can I give you a hint? I don't think my hint will give it away for you if you already know they're producing too little. So, let's look at point D. Okay, forget the LM curve. At point D, we have an interest rate of 4% and we have a level of GDP 1,100. At an interest rate of 4%, what level of production would give us equilibrium in the goods market at an interest rate of 4%, what level of output would give us equilibrium? It would be a level like that, right? Okay. So at an interest rate of 4%, we should be producing more, right? So that should tell you something about where we are in the aggregate expenditure model. What point would point D correspond to in our aggregate expenditure model? If we take our initial aggregate expenditure diagram, and I tell you that for a given interest rate, or in fact, let me tell a slightly different story. Let's say we started at equilibrium at equilibrium level Y1, corresponding to Y1. Okay? So AE1, Y1, and our interest rates are R1. And I tell you that interest rates fall, okay, so interest rates go down, my aggregate expenditure curve shifts upwards. I would move from my initial point of equilibrium on Y1, and I would move up to a new point here. Okay? At this point, what do I see? For the given interest rates, my level of spending, right, my level of spending is too high for my level of production. I'm spending too much given this interest rate, right, for me to be in equilibrium. So what happens? My economy moves from this intermediate point towards my new equilibrium point, right? In other words, at this point, I'm going to call it point D. Maybe there's a connection, right? At point D, the interest rate, right, given this level of expenditure, this level of production, Y1, the interest rate leads to a level of spending that is much higher than the amount we're producing if we were at Y1. So we would need to move from point D to a higher level of output if we don't change the interest rate to move to a point of equilibrium. So firms should start producing more. Are you with me? Firms should be producing more if we're at point D. Okay? Sorry, and just put into perspective here, this entire ISLM model as well, remember I said it's based on the aggregate expenditure model, which keeps prices fixed. Right? So we're not adjusting prices yet. All prices are fixed. So firms are selling more than they want to. They don't change prices when they're selling more than they expected, they don't change prices. They produce more. Okay? So if we now go down to our ISLM diagram, and we're at a point like point D, which I'm going to tell you corresponds to point D in our previous ISLM diagram, we have some interest rate where at point D, the level of output is too small for equilibrium. Here's our equilibrium level of output, okay, given some interest rates. So what should firms do? They should start producing more, right? Okay. So we're at point D. We don't have equilibrium in our goods market, so we're at point D. Firms start producing more. What happens when they start producing more? What happens in the money market when we start producing, when we start increasing output? When output increases, what happens to money demand? Money demand shifts from your perspective, to the right. As money demand shifts to the right, what happens to the interest rates? The interest rate starts increasing. Excellent. So now, as firms start producing more, the interest rate starts increasing. As the interest rate starts increasing, we start moving along our LM curve to the right because our money demand is shifting. We're moving to higher and higher points along our LM curve. As the interest rate starts increasing, what happens in the goods market, in the aggregate expenditure model? As the interest rate goes up, what happens to investment spending? Goes down. So what happens in our aggregate expenditure model? The aggregate expenditure curve is shifting down, right? We are moving to points of equilibrium further and further to the, from your perspective, to the, so you've got an aggregate expenditure curve that's shifting down. What's happening to equilibrium? It's moving further and further to the left, right? In other words, we're moving to the left along our IS curve until we eventually end up at a point of equilibrium on both those curves, right? As firms start producing more, interest rates start going up. And as interest rates start going up, we move to the left along the IS curve, we move to the right along the LM curve until we arrive at equilibrium. Yeah? So, let me give you one more example to draw for yourself, and then I'll continue on with something slightly different. Oops. So let's say we have an initial ISLM diagram. So we've got Y and R, and we've got equilibrium, ISLM, okay? Here's our initial point of equilibrium. Are you with me? Now, I don't think you can see the same colors that I can here because this projector cable is something wrong with it. But anyway, I'm now changing to green. Okay, it looks like yellow, so that's fine. Now my IS curve is going to shift. I'm going to shift it from IS0 to IS1. Right? I'm moving from IS0 to IS1, which means my point of equilibrium moves from point A to a new equilibrium point, point B. Are you with me? Okay? So here's the thing. Now I want to compare point A to point B. How do I get from point A to point B? And you should see that the relationship between point A and point B here looks suspiciously like the relationship between points D and E here. Are you with me? How do I get from point A to point B? When my IS curve shifts from IS0 to IS1, I move from A to B, right? Why do I move from A to B? What is the problem with equilibrium point A once my IS curve has shifted to the right? I've moved from a position of equilibrium in my goods markets, and now I have changed my expenditure patterns. My IS curve has shifted. I've changed my spending. So my initial point of equilibrium, point A is now no longer on my new IS curve. Is it still on my LM curve, point A? Yes, so the problem is not in the money market. The problem is in the goods market. I've changed my spending. I was in a position of equilibrium, and now I've changed my spending. Okay? If I remain at point A, there's a problem. Point A. I'm spending more than I am producing. Remember point D. What was the problem with point D? I was spending more than I was producing. At point A, it can't be a point of equilibrium. At point A, I've increased my spending. Right? But I'm still producing some level of output. I need to now increase my level of output. Right? Production must increase. Moving from point A to point B, firms start producing more. As they start producing more, what happens to the demand for money? The demand for money starts increasing. As the demand for money starts increasing, what happens to interest rates? Interest rates start increasing. As interest rates start increasing, what happens to investment spending? starts decreasing. I start moving to the left along my IS curve. I'm moving to the right along my LM curve to get to point B. So who's with me? Put your hand up if you are like, yes, cool, I know where we're going. Yeah, that was my suspicion. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, is there? Yes. No. There was a change in spending, so I've shifted my IS curve. Okay. So now we're going to give an exact example of that. Okay. We're going to do exactly the same example. Well, I'm saying if we were at point A, our level of output is too small for our level of spending, given that interest rate at point A. Right? Remember, if interest rates don't change, we increase our spending, the level of output at point A is too small, given that level of spending. So what do we need to do? Start producing more. So we move from point A to point B. Here we go. We've got some fiscal policy analysis. I told you this stuff. We start with the basics and we put all the basics together, it starts getting hectic. So you've got to know those basics. Do you want to carry on chatting for a while? Do you want like 2 minutes? Or should we carry on? You want 2 minutes to chat and then we can carry on? Okay, let's do that. So I'll give you 2 minutes, you chat. If you've got any questions, ask them, and then we're going to move on. So what did we say? When we shifted the IS curve, I said we've clearly changed our spending patterns. We are now, when we shift our IS curve, if we compare it to, say, point D to point E, what was the problem with point D? Was we were spending too much relative to the amount that we were producing. So I said when we shifted our IS curve, we're going to move to a new point of equilibrium, point B. But what is wrong? Why are we moving away from point A? Something must have changed. Well, if we compare these two equilibrium points, A and B, we see that they have the same relationship as D and E. In other words, at point A, given the shift in the IS curve, there must have been a change in our spending patterns because now we are spending more than we are producing. Whereas before we were spending the same amount that we were producing. So this shift in the IS curve must have come from some change in spending patterns for some reason, right? Now we're going to do an example of exactly what that means, okay? What can cause a change in our spending patterns? Well, what are the components of spending? What are the components of aggregate expenditure? Look familiar? Okay. So what I'm saying is if we change one of these components, but not because of a change in interest rates. Remember, we're shifting an entire IS curve. An IS curve, if we shift the curve, right? If I'm plotting output against interest rate, if I change interest rate, then I'm changing a value on my y-axis. If I change a value on a y-axis, then it's a movement along the curve. What I'm talking about is a shift in the entire curve. So it's not a change in interest rate. So if I shift the entire curve, how would I do that? Well, what happens if, for example, government spending were to increase? Government just, in its budget, it passes a budget speech. It presents a budget to Parliament. Parliament approves the budget, and in that budget it says, government is going to spend more. Cool. What happens when we just increase spending? Well, that is the kind of thing that shifts our IS curve. Okay? Now, if we have an increase in government spending, What do we call that? That is a fiscal policy action. Change in taxes, change in government spending, fiscal policy. Right? Okay. So you should see that this diagram here looks suspiciously like this diagram here. Yeah? Okay. So a shift in government spending. We now have a model where we can say, well, what is going to happen in the economy if government spending increases? We now have something practical. What is going to happen? Let's look. Here's our initial point of equilibrium, point A. We increase government spending. We've increased government spending. I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry. Okay. We've increased government spending. What happens at our new equilibrium? Well, what happens to interest rates when government increases spending? What happens to interest rates? Compare point A to point B. What happens to the interest rates? What happens to our level of GDP? Okay, that looks cool. When GDP increases, that's a good thing, right? That's economic growth. Yeah? Sounds good. Government increases spending. We get more GDP. Okay, interest rates go up. Okay. Is that a bad thing? A good thing? What is that? Does it matter? Okay. But a couple of things have happened. Let's bear in mind exactly what's happened as soon as the government increases spending. Compare point A to point B. That increase in interest rates has meant what has happened to investment? Investment has gone down. Right? So do you remember terminology from the previous chapter 24? Crowding out. Crowding out. You increase government spending, interest rates go up, you crowd out private investment. Okay? Also, people have changed their money holdings. They're not holding money as an asset anymore. They're holding money for transactions. Okay? So that you've changed what's happening in the money market. You've changed why people are holding their money. You've changed the amount of private investment. But your GDP has gone up. So is this a bad thing? What we can do, we've got 3 minutes, and I think this will be a great way to end this off. I want you to talk to the people amongst you quickly for 3 minutes, and then right at the end, I'll just get some feedback from you. Government increases spending, it crowds out investments. Good or bad? I want you to tell me 3 good things and 3 bad things. Okay, 2. 2 good things, 2 bad things. Okay? Okay. Could you regale me with stories of good and evil? What is good? So the government crowded out investments. Okay? What is good about that? Is there something good associated with that? What do you think? Okay, let's start the other way. Is there something bad? Anything you want to tell me about why that might be bad? Literally nothing. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I like it. Ah, that is a fantastic answer. You just killed it. Okay. Okay, everyone else can just go home. Okay, cool. So here's one thing. What could be good about government increases spending? It increases GDP. With an increase in GDP, we already know economic growth is good. Why is economic growth good? An increase in GDP brings along with it increased standards of living. Usually, well, what we're going to see in the next chapter, once we introduce aggregate supply, is that an increase in GDP also brings along an increase in employment. In other words, you're producing more stuff, you're employing more people. Okay? Remember, when spending increases, firms must now produce more. When we produce more, we employ more people. Great. Increased government spending. We increase employment. We increase standards of living. Fantastic. Why don't we just have government spending all the time? Here's the point that was raised. What is government spending on? Let's say the government increases spending on the salaries of the people that do work for the government, right? So municipal workers. I think it's called SAMWU. Yeah, I think that's the South African Municipal Workers Union, I think. Anyway, so SAMWU says, no, we want wages to go up. They negotiate with government. SAMWU is part of COSATU. COSATU is part of the Tripartite Alliance. COSATU and the ANC, you know, you can't have too much friction. Okay, we'll give you a raise. Why? We're government. Doesn't matter. We'll just print the money. Like, we don't sell anything. Whatever. Spend more. Great. Spend more on salaries. Fantastic. GDP goes up. Everyone's earning more. Great. Problem is, interest rates go up, which means people are investing less. If you're investing less, what's happening to your level of capital? It's not growing at the same rate, or potentially, if depreciation is at a higher rate than now what your investment rate is, your capital is depreciating. What does that mean for your long-term growth? You might have a short-term increase in GDP, but a long-term decrease in GDP. Okay. So government increasing spending because it wants to pay municipal workers more? Not a good idea. What if government is increasing spending on things like road infrastructure? Okay. So maybe there's some private spending that's being crowded out, right? But in its place, we have more public infrastructure that makes growth in the future even faster. There's a potential good thing. We don't do it in this course, but I'll look for it tomorrow anyway. We did at some point, when the course was slightly different, we did have South African data. I'll go back and find the most recent South African data. We'll look at what government spends money on. Sorry? On ETO. Yeah, I mean, we can, I don't know what information is available on that, because SANRAL's very cagey about the whole thing. So there might not be much information about spending on ETO. But I will you get the municipal accounts that shows you how much they're spending on everything. Take a look at it, and then we can just, see how we feel about it. Okay, see you tomorrow. We're also going to go through tuts. Do you have 2 tuts, right? 2 tuts to go through tomorrow, yeah.